So our episode today will focus on large-scale IT projects, which is particularly problematic for lawyers who advise clients who engage in these types of IT projects. It could be a software development project or a system integration project, but we find that there are a lot of principles in these agreements and also principles of project management that if you put them together, you can be effective in providing support for your clients. We're very pleased to have two guests today. I will not be speaking, I'll just be moderating. One is a senior associate from our firm, Lars Serso, and the other is Arup Meiti. The first to make a presentation is Attorney Serso. She is, and I'll introduce her now. She's a senior associate at the firm, Dicini Putet Dicini. She heads our fintech practice and advises fintechs and IT companies and startups. She also heads the firm's legal education initiatives for startups and has been a very active partner of Kubo and supporting Kubo, the firm. She's the lead in the firm's support for Kubo. She is a next generation partner identified by Legal 500 Asia Pacific. She's a graduate of the UP College of Law in 2015. And she also is a consultant at the UP Law Center's Technology Law and Policy Program. So I'd like to introduce you to Attorney Serso, Lars Serso. Lars?
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, so I hope you guys can see my slides. All right, so for my part, I'll be discussing the legal considerations that should be considered by the project owner and by the legal team for both the vendor and the client when entering into contracts for certain IT projects. All right. So this presentation assumes that your organization has a need for certain pieces of technology or certain IT software, or it could also be the case that you are the entity providing such software. So IT projects and IT arrangements could involve various types of contracts and various types of arrangements. It could involve an instance where you just need the software license. It could involve software development projects where you need customized IT products built from scratch, specific for your organizations and to address your needs. It could also be that you need a service provider for systems integration, and this would involve a bunch of arrangements. It could involve off-the-shelf software. It could also involve a bit of customization. And then, of course, you may also have a need for support and maintenance services for your IT products. So we won't go through it one by one, but the goal of this presentation is to highlight or to zero in on certain provisions that you will need to carefully consider when going through the negotiations. So even before you get to the point of actually negotiating a contract, we assume that you've already gone through certain stages of like assessing your need for an IT product, assessing your considerations in terms of costing and in terms of timelines. So knowing these factors, those flashed in the screen, would be important in guiding your team in the software or the service negotiation stage. So for the scope of work, your team would have to identify whether you actually need to build something from scratch or you can get something that's off the shelf. Whether the service that you need would come from just one supplier or will it come from multiple suppliers? Will you need maintenance services for that piece of software? And then for timeline, you need to consider where your IT project would stand in reference to other components of your bigger project. The reason would be you should know, or you should identify if it's a dependency for other things, so that if you're sensitive as to deadlines, as to timeline, then you can consider putting in provisions that would disincentivize your provider from delay or from other failures, and then of course cost. All right, now, so let's say that you have identified that your organization needs a certain piece of software for your, either for your product or for your internal processes. So let's say that you've identified that you need something from scratch or something customized. So it's important to put into writing what those deliverables are. If this is software, the desired functionalities should be specified in your contract. So it's important that your legal team and your tech team work and communicate effectively. And then, of course, deadlines should be specified. So in terms of methodology, one of our panelists would be discussing this more closely, maybe later or during the discussion. It usually takes two forms. Either you set up your deliverables or you specify it through like a waterfall method where you identify specific milestones, or you do Agile. So it's for contracts, it's simpler if you can implement a waterfall method. So this would refer to instances where you can divvy up, or you can divide your IT development project into certain milestones that could be clearly identified. So in the screen that I'm flashing, I've copied a portion of one of our contracts. This would refer to the milestone annex. So ideally, your team should be able to identify the milestone. So that's the portion, that's a highlighted portion. And then ideally also, you should have your provider commit to certain deadlines. Okay, so let's say, so here, so column 1 would be the milestone, and column 2 would be the deadline when they should present that piece of the project component. And then third column would refer to the payments that would be due in terms after the milestone is completed. Okay, so it's important, especially if you're sensitive as to cost, that you insert acceptance test provisions into your contract. So here, similar to what's flashed in this page, we should specify the criteria that would guide both parties in determining whether a certain deliverable conforms or doesn't conform to specifications. You should set presentation deadlines. And then again, also, you should also set mechanisms that would guide both parties in the acceptance test. So let's say milestone A is presented to the client, and for the client, it fails to conform to an agreed upon specification. It's best that the parties are given deadlines. Let's say after presentation, the client would have 5 days or 10 days to test the project. And if the client observes certain errors or certain bugs in the software, then the client should be able to show and demonstrate why that's a nonconformity. And then, of course, the contract should obligate the provider to remedy such defect or the bug, provided it's demonstrable. The provider should be obligated to remediate the non-conforming aspects. Okay. Then a note on change orders. As noted, diba in the first page, one of the most important aspects of your software contract would be your ability to clearly state the functionalities. So now, in the stage of the development, if let's say the client suddenly changes its mind and wants to change a certain aspect of the project, your contract should contain a provision on change orders such that a change in the specifications should not be binding on the provider if both parties did not agree on the change. So this is important in terms of preventing scope creep, where your project ends up covering certain aspects that none of you intended, thus leading to either over budgeting or missing deadlines and missing set timelines. So the change order should take into should enable the provider, if you're the provider, to adjust the cost and adjust deadlines and thus prevent possible events of breach. All right. Now for certain systems integration arrangements where the project would involve maybe some licensing of third-party software or your own software, and then some customization or some development. So the pieces composing your project should be specified. So if ABC would refer to the obligation of the provider to give you with software licenses, that should be clear, and the functionalities for each software license should be clear, like what's the extent of rights that the license would give you. Can you use the software anywhere in the world, or is it limited to, let's say, the Philippines? Can you use the software? Can you sub-license the software further to your affiliates or to your subsidiaries, or is it limited to your entity? So that should be specified there. And then, is it limited to a certain number of authorized users? So this is important if, for example, you will need your entire team to use or to be an authorized user of a specific software, then that should be taken into consideration. All right. So now this is a tricky aspect of some contracts. Like, let's say you're engaging a tech provider to provide you with a crucial piece of technology. However, 90% of the software being provided to you is given or is actually being provided by another third party, like a subcontractor of your direct provider. Then if you want to be strict about it, your contract should allocate responsibility. So by default, if I'm the provider and I'm providing you with third-party software, it's in my interest to disclaim responsibility over all of these third-party software, right? Like, I disclaim responsibility over defects arising from the third-party software. I disclaim responsibility over infringement allegations arising from those third-party products. So if you're on the other end of the table and you're the customer, it's in your interest to obligate your provider to be or to hold your provider responsible for these third-party products. So in terms of drafting the contract, you should consider where you stand. And then another thing, in terms of support and maintenance, of course, so that also goes into, it works the same way. If you're the customer, you should see to it that the warranties provided by your provider extends to the third-party products, right? Especially if a bulk of the project would actually depend on those third-party products. So now, if there's a general disclaimer over all of it, then your contract really does nothing to protect your interest if you're the customer. And then, of course, the contract should also be able to specify what systems or deliverables are the responsibilities of the client. So in a software arrangement, this would usually refer to, let's say, the hardware or the necessary infrastructure. That's usually the responsibility of the client. Now, this provision would be crucial when, let's say, there are certain hardware requirements necessary for integration. So let's say the software would require certain minimum infrastructure system requirements. It should be stated here. So in case the software fails to be integrated into the client's system, it would be clear. It would be easy for the parties to determine whether that failure to integrate is because of the failure of the client to comply with set system requirements, or if it's the failure of the provider to provide the correct system requirements. All right, now a note on open source software. All right, there are certain cases, like let's say for like e-commerce websites. If you're a provider of an e-commerce development, if you provide development services for e-commerce platforms, you may be using certain modules that are covered by open source licenses. So this is okay, but if you're the client, part of your diligence in scoping out the ability of your provider should be in finding out whether their service or their software would include open source software. So why is this important? It's important in assessing the ability of the provider in providing warranties and disclaimers over the software. So usually open source software would already come with baked-in license provisions, which the user or in this case, the provider and the user would be bound to follow. So this would affect the ability of the provider to, let's say, transfer rights over the components involving open source software. It may also affect the ability of the end user, the end client, to use that software. Like let's say if there are limitations, you're automatically bound by the open source license limitations. And then also another note on open source software. Most of the license provisions for open source software would require the user to, so they can use it for free, right? But in exchange, the developer that incorporated the open source software would have to disclose the resulting product which incorporated the open source software. Now, if you're sensitive about like the secrecy of your code, etc., then this is something you have to watch out for. All right, now for warranty clauses. When lawyers review service software contracts, like license contracts, development contracts, a warranty clause such as the one flashed in the screen is something, is a usual template provision. So in this example, it states that the provider makes no warranty or representation, express or implied, including but in no way limited to warranty as to quality, condition, merchantability, suitability, or fitness for a particular purpose. In some instances, the warranty on non-infringement would also be disclaimed. So when you're talking to a lawyer for the provider, they would say that this is a standard provision. We can't edit it. It's standard for software contracts. However, that's not exactly true. So if you're the customer and you have some sort of negotiations leverage, the diligent thing would be to carefully carve out this provision. So if you're buying a piece of software off the shelf, something like this could be acceptable. But if you've engaged a provider to provide you with customized solutions from scratch, then you may have some negotiation leverage to demand, let's say, that they warrant that the software will function consistent with what they've marketed to you. They can warrant that the code is not infringing, for example. So the best way, again, is to carve each and every phrase here and to not accept a blanket disclaimer on warranties. And then another thing to consider when providing warranty clauses, if you're the provider and your client wants you to warrant that the software will function a certain way, that the software is non-infringing, etc., and that any breach of warranty will obligate you to remedy the same, then you should consider whether your own product as the provider is actually dependent on third-party products, if that makes sense. So let's say your software would the whether or not your software will work will depend on the support that you get from a third-party maintenance provider. Then if you're making a warranty that the software you're providing will function, let's say, 99% of the time, then your maintenance agreement with your third-party provider should contain some sort of mirror provision that would actually allow you to comply with your obligations to your end client. Okay. Another provision to consider would be provisions that are aimed at controlling or at disincentivizing delay. So usually we encourage putting in delay penalties if you're the client. And if your provider is confident that they can deliver on a certain date, then you should negotiate provisions that say for every day of delay, you can charge a certain amount of penalty. And then if you're the provider and you want to limit that liability, then you can agree on a cap. Like let's say the delay should be no more than 10% of the total fees, etc. And then another provision alongside delay penalties would be a provision that would allow the client to engage an alternative service provider if the main provider commits a breach or fails to deliver on time. Then of course the right to be able to, if you're the client, you'd want the right to be able to terminate in case of any delay. And it's also in your interest to say that the remedies are cumulative and not alternative. Meaning if you pick one, then that should not prejudice your right to let's say to terminate or to exercise the other remedies available under the contract and available under law. So this is crucial because sometimes providers in their template contracts, they would say that the act of the client of picking one remedy, let's say the client already exercised its right to collect delay penalties, would eliminate the right of the client to, let's say, terminate the contract or go after the provider for breach. So just watch out for that. And again, for intellectual property, so just check if the provisions are consistent with the commercial arrangements that you've discussed with your provider. So if the developer who built out your system warrants that you should own the system after, then that should be in your IP section. And then in terms of source code and documentation, if both the parties agreed that the source code would be transferred to the client, then that should be baked in as well. Although sometimes getting the source code would, in reality, really do nothing for the client, since it's not like the source code will be understandable. It's not like there's a universal language that all developers could understand. So sometimes you have the source code, but the provider breached, and then even if you have the source code, you're still left with a piece of software that you can't use. So there, which is actually where the maintenance provisions of a contract comes into play. Because most of the time, the only party that could actually maintain your software would also be the party that developed it. All right. So same thing with the delay. Again, in case of infringement, if you're a client, it's okay if the types of remedies in case of infringement are spelled out in the contract. However, again, you should include the provision stating that it should be your choice as to what remediation measure the provider should take. And those remedies, again, should be cumulative and not stated in the alternative. For termination, what's crucial? The crucial thing here is if you're the client receiving the software product or the software services, ideally you should limit the ability to terminate to yourself, meaning you don't give the provider the chance to terminate the contract, at least not for convenience. The reason is if you give your provider the right to terminate, you may be stuck in a situation where, let's say, you're months into the project and then suddenly your provider terminates, right? Now, even if you can engage, theoretically, you can engage another provider, it will be difficult for another provider to come in and try to make sense of a semi-built software. It's not like, let's say, construction, that it's obvious what you need to do. With software development, you may not be able to continue where the first provider ended, and you might end up just starting from scratch. So now again, if your IT project is a dependency for a bigger project, this would cause substantial delays and probably cost. So again, just limit the right to terminate yourself. At most, you can probably allow your provider to terminate in case of breach, which in the case of, if you're the customer, probably the only breach that you'll be able to be faulted for would be failure to pay, for example. Okay. Now for maintenance, why is this important? This is important because, of course, if you have a piece of software, more likely than not, it would break down every once in a while, or there'll be bugs or errors. And as I mentioned, even if you have the source code, it's likely that the only team that could understand that that source code is the team that developed it. So you may end up having to negotiate another maintenance agreement. And actually, sometimes developers make more money providing support and maintenance than in providing the initial development services. So what should you watch out for? Watch out for inclusions and exclusions. If you're the provider, then most likely you'd want to exclude, let's say, defects arising from the acts of third parties, or defects arising from the willful misconduct of the customer mismo, or defects arising from unauthorized combination of the software, installation that's not consistent with your instructions, etc. And then, of course, if you're the customer, you'd want less exclusions. And then also for support of third-party products, as mentioned a while ago, usually in the default contracts, support for third-party products are excluded. So again, if the third-party products are crucial to the functioning of the entire system and you're the customer, you should look for a way and try to negotiate that this be covered. And then, of course, SLA should be there. This would refer to the escalation mechanisms, how you make a complaint, how you request for support, etc. Most of the time, you should be able to require your provider to commit that the software will be fully functioning, let's say 97% of the time. And then if that piece of software fails to perform as committed, then you may want to ask for the right to collect rebates or right to collect penalties. And then again, our note on remedies comes into play here. So if you're the customer, you should see to it that even if you collect for rebates, demand for refunds, etc., or penalties, you should see to it that this will not affect your right and ability to go after the provider for or to exercise other rights arising again from the contract and from law. Yeah. So what you want to avoid is a situation wherein, so you already have the software, but it ends up not performing according to what you've expected. And then the provider would just give you rebates for it. However, if it's a 5-year contract, then you're stuck with your provider for 5 years. And it'll be difficult for you to get out of it, since the rebate clause could have been worded in such a way that it's your exclusive remedy in case of software failures. Right, now for other terms, just quickly, these are usually captioned in the contract as, like, let's say, general terms or miscellaneous provisions, and maybe some lawyers have the tendency of just ignoring these provisions, thinking that these are boilerplate templates. However, these are also important. Like, for example, the entire agreement clause. This clause essentially says that the written contract contains the parties' agreement, the parties' entire agreement about the subject, which is the software services, and supersedes all oral or written agreements made between the parties. So this is crucial, since sometimes the project proponent from the client side usually speaks to a salesperson from the provider. And salespeople have the tendency of over-promising or over-committing, saying that everything's possible. But then once you have the written contract, you find out that the provider actually disclaimed everything and you can't hold the provider to certain warranties. And since you've signed off on a contract that says the written agreement is your entire agreement, you can't go after the provider for the stuff committed by, let's say, the salesperson or any other party. That's not baked into the agreement. And then for dispute resolution, essentially you agree whether you want to go to court or whether you want to limit the ability of parties to settle disputes via arbitration. For governing law, if you're dealing with foreign providers, then you may want to ensure that the contract is actually governed by Philippine law and not foreign law, in which case you may have to hire foreign counsel and advisors for that. And another provision would be assignability. So this refers to the right of the parties to assign obligations or rights arising from the contract. Now, if you're the client, you may want to, and you chose the provider for a specific reason. Let's say the provider is credible, the provider has a good history of providing software products. Then you may want to make sure that the obligations there would be done by the provider. So you'd want to limit the provider's ability to assign any of its obligations to a third party. All right, so from my end, that's it. If you have any questions later on negotiating certain clauses, etc., then we can discuss later. For now, Attorney JJ.
Okay, so let's see if I can stop yours. You stop na lang your screen sharing.
There.
All right. So our next speaker is Arup Mehdi. He is the CEO and founder of Blast Asia. He received a bachelor's degree in engineering from Rani Durgavati Vishwa Vidyayala. He has an MBA from the Asian Institute of Management, where he is now an adjunct faculty. He is also a certified Scrum Master for Agile from Scrum Alliance, and is the president and co-founder of Quick Reach Inc. He's also a director at the Philippine Software Industry Association for the last 10 years, and is the co-founder of Spring.ph, which is unless I'm mistaken, it's a project set up by the PSIA to mentor startups in the software industry. Welcome, Arup.
Thank you, JJ. Let me bring up a slide. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a good Thursday. Wish it was a Friday, but it's not. Let's see, hold on. Let me know once you can see my screen.
There.
Okay. So, yeah, Attorney Lars shared a lot of interesting things from the perspective of a lawyer and from a perspective of how to protect the rights and all. But let me start by saying this, that any software project is done to meet a business goal. And a lot of time we get confused whether meeting the deadline or the budget is the main goal. In reality, the biggest point of failure might be once the business goals are not met. And the reason for not meeting business goal, other than probably the budget and time, can also be more online with the uncertainties, the risk. Now, what I have in front of you is called Ntcp Model, or it's called Diamond Framework also. It's if you want to read more about it, you can get this book. It's from Harvard publication. and it's called Diamond Framework for Project Risk Management or something to that extent. Now, let's try to understand what it has. Basically, what it says is before you get into any project, any contracting, it's best to look at it from this 4 axes. So the N is the novelty, meaning how unique, how new are you trying to, how often, for example, if we talk of accounting software, um, it's very low on the novelty side. But if you're talking about AI tool that does a whole lot of things automated for your specific business or something which probably no one else has it, then it's in the platform to breakthrough region. So that's what you call novelty. And novelty may also have to take into consideration both your provider, you as a company, and the technology that you have available in the country. So something may be getting to be a more of like a platform derivative, let's say in the Silicon Valley, but in the local ecosystem with the vendors, maybe it's still pretty new. No one has done it. So all of those consideration gives you the novelty rating. The second is the technology side. Now, when you say low tech, it doesn't necessarily mean old technology or something. We're not talking COBOL or something here. But what we are talking about is something that's well established, that's already kind of stable technology that everyone is using, compared to picking up something very new, like a tool, a framework, or you building something that hasn't been in the market for long, and you need it for your project. So that increases the risk. The other factor is the complexity. So when Attorney Lars or even when JJ was talking about very large projects, typically the reason it's large is because it actually is, it's on this side of the scale, meaning there are lots of dependencies of sub-modules and subsystem that has to come together, and everything has to work as planned for it to be successful. And this risk keeps increasing exponentially as you increase the complexity. And this is very important to keep in mind. And the last but not the least is the timeline. The thing is, when you talk to most clients, they usually want everything yesterday. That's the typical joke at the first meeting. But this is something which needs to be thought through very clearly, because increasing the velocity or increasing the pace at which you want something done also increases the risk of the project. And it changes the entire nature of how you want to go about doing it, and increases the chance of failure. So it's good to kind of have like an analysis at the beginning of a project. And that's the reason they call it diamond framework. It kind of creates a diamond of a kind to assess where does your project lie. And the question would be now, why does it matter? Why should we consider this? Because on the basis of this framework and the next things we're going to talk about, you need to be able to define the methodology, like what project methodology should you go for. But at this stage, let me see this upfront, and we'll go into more details later. If you are not into software business, meaning your business is not selling software and software license, and if you come to me and say, Arup, okay, we want to build this, my first reaction would be, don't build software. If you're not into software business, do not build software. And I'll go back and substantiate that discussion in subsequent files, subsequent pages. Okay, now, so this slide talks about methodology, and I'll go more to it. Basically, we have project methodologies, or we call it waterfall. So waterfall methods of project is what you call more of the predictive ones. So meaning predictive would mean you can define in detail upfront everything that you want done in the project. The same way Attorney Lars mentioned that, you should identify milestone, and not only milestone, but along with that, you need to have clear acceptance criteria written down clearly. So when the milestone comes in, the criteria of testing it is upfront written. To do that, you need to be doing something which you can totally envision upfront. You can already have it well defined to the extent that you can test it. And that's basically a predictive project, a predictive software, or a project with predictive outputs, meaning you know what exactly you want. The reality is very different. You have, let's say you're trying to build something, and my next part of the statement would be, if it is predictive, it has been done so many times over, why in world are you building it? Just buy it. Buy something off the shelf, or better, subscribe to something that exists online. Because if it is, for example, like accounting software, don't build accounting software again, because you can pay $30 a month and get a software that's perfectly working, and you can get to start using it tomorrow. But we'll talk more about it, and maybe there are times when you need to build it, but this should be the last option. But in most cases, the reason you want to build a software is because you're trying to do something unique. You're trying to do something that you haven't done before. You're trying to build a tool that your company wants to be one of the few to have. You want it to be a differentiator for your business. Now, in that line, you probably do not have a clear idea, and trust me, I've been doing this for 20, 25 years now. Most of the time, most companies cannot define exactly what they want if it is something that is new. And it's like a movie, I can tell you a story of some movie, but you would not know till you have seen it. It's an experiential thing. So software, by the nature of it, is you actually know whether you like it, or what features more you need, what tweaks you need once you see it. Unless it's a very standard, like as I said, it's a HR software, or it's a accounting software, which is kind of common vocabulary, and everyone knows it needs to have A, B, C, this components. But anything unique you try to build, there's always a vagueness with it. So when you go into that territory, it's new, it's unique. You want to create a differentiated value proposition for your business using the software, yet you cannot predict exactly what you need. How do you go about it? And that's where the agile methodologies come in. Let me talk more about it moving forward. In fact, there are various different methodologies to go by. So when the objective, or the goal and the requirements are very clear, you do what you call linear project management methodology, which is primarily what you hear is the waterfall, where basically you start by defining the requirement, and then you kind of start building it, and then you test it, and then you roll it out, and then you move to maintenance, something like that. So that's waterfall. You finish one before you go to the other, and so forth. But if that's not crystal clear upfront, then you move to the other methodologies. And the most common, without going into too many of this complex discussion, because when the requirements are not clear, but your goal is clear, you go for what you call adaptive, which is, or incremental, which is basically Scrum and Agile. And most projects, you will either talk about waterfall or something like Scrum. There are other methodologies which are more relevant, especially when your goal is not clear, meaning you're doing a startup. And in a startup, your requirements keep evolving to the market findings. So you go out, you talk to customer, you think they need this. By the time you show them something, then you realize, no, that's not exactly what they want. They want something else. So your goals can keep shifting along with that, the requirement shifts. So that's where you come into the territory of extreme programming and all, but we'll not touch on that today. Let's go back to the core of it and the two primary methodologies that are involved and the responsibilities that lies with it. So waterfall methodology, the responsibility of defining the feature to the very detail, including having the test criteria for accepting those features, actually lies with the client. And if the client knows exactly what they want, they can define it exactly and provides this to the vendor. The vendor's responsibility is to define the cost and schedule of delivering it. And this is basically what you call plan-driven development approach. So a lot of the discussion that Attorney Lars talked about is about waterfall methodology. And the reality is there's a lot of projects in the country that are still doing waterfall. And from my personal experience, we have stopped doing waterfall for the last 13, 14 years now, because this is a recipe of unhappy. Everyone is going to be unhappy in this from my experience. It's the lowest chance of success, especially for a large project. It's okay to do it for a small 3 months, 2 months, 5 months max project. But as soon as you try to get into a waterfall for a very large project, it's always a heartache and pain. And even if you get it done, so like as a company, we have always the philosophy of delivering, not leaving in a project halfway. And we have always lost money on every waterfall project we did. And we have stopped doing it for the over last 10 years, 12 years now. So how do we go about doing it? We do it agile. So what happens in agile and how do you manage risk in agile? So client's responsibility usually is to set the budget and the time. So let's say 2 million peso and 6 months. And then you define what's your vision, what's the objective. And this is where you start dealing with unique things. And you start defining as a client what you need, while the vendor in a iteration, for example, most of the time in like a 2-week iteration, keeps delivering features that are complete and usable. So that's the key. If you get into agile, and then if your vendor is failing to deliver what we call shippable increments every end of the sprint, that's a red flag, and that's where you need to already have the hard discussion. So the risk management of this is less in the contract, but more in what they call the proof of the pudding is on the eating. And every 15 day or every week, whatever is the iteration, you get an output, you see it, you test it. And if it looks good, you are happy, and the vendor goes about delivering incrementally. Now, what Agile allows is to change your requirement on the fly, depending on the market realities or new things you find, or once you have something, some components, you use it, you realize that you want something more. So it gives the client the freedom to change the requirement. In fact, it welcomes changing requirement to meet the business objective better, while without changing the cost and schedule. So you still work with that time box and the budget, but you kind of switch around features and functions to what gives the most business value. I hope that's clear so far. I have a couple of other slides before we can have a clear discussion. So, okay, I just wanted to share you, now since I talked about Agile and I talked about sometime what you call minimum viable minimum viable product, there are wrong way of doing it and there are right way of doing it. So this is not Agile delivery. This also is not Agile delivery. So this one is more actually a waterfall or milestone based delivery. While this one is actually, I don't know what, but this is a bad idea because literally every iteration, whatever you produce, get thrown away to build the next one. The output of this doesn't go to this, or the output of this doesn't go to that. So this is definitely not good at any sense. This is the ideal Agile way of building a product where what you have as an output every iteration is somewhat usable. And as you can see, this slowly evolves into what you need it to be. But the output from each version is already good enough to have a feel of what's coming, and you can provide input to adjust and modify to create the ideal product that you need. And lastly, I would like to share, so I have been saying for a while, like, you should not build custom software. Yet you want to have your unique business processes captured, especially at today's new reality with automation and digitization. Yet, if you don't go for building customer from the ground up, how do you do it? And the answer lies in what we call the no code and low code way of going about it. This is not very well known in the local industry, but this is the way the world is moving to. And the main benefits of going low code and no code is super fast, meaning you can build a solution on the fly in matter of days, not months. You can have the full flexibility, and the modern way of no code, low code provides scalability like anything. Like, you can build it and you can start using it for 5 people today, but if you need to move it to 5,000, it's just add in more license and boom, it starts working. Nothing to change, nothing to do. Simple and fast integration. Usually most of the good tools in this category comes in integrated with or integration ability built in. So you can easily integrate into solutions and tools that you already have or are using currently as in your business, for example, accounting system, inventory system, etc. And the other thing is it can do without having software developers. Of course, you need certain amount of knowledge of building a solution, but it does not require coding, which eliminates a whole lot of problem, including a lot of things that Attorney Lars was mentioning, like, if a developer leaves halfway, how will you continue, etc. That doesn't matter because there's no code to read or change. And depending on the license and business type, but yeah, most of the time you have the license and you can actually keep building many different applications on it. Something like, what you do with, say, Excel, you can keep building different models and using it. And one of the other things that it eliminates is no more hosting. No more hosting, no more maintenance. So someone else is already taking care of all the cybersecurity worries that you need to have, or the hosting, and it's taking care of loading and working 24/7. You don't need a team to buy and maintain servers and everything, and no more cost of electricity. And there's so many other costs that comes into consideration when you have it running on your own data center that gets removed. Like I said, security is nothing to worry about. And the best thing is it's purely OpEx. So, you pay as you need. There is literally no more CapEx. And, you increase the usage if it's making business sense. You reduce or remove or replace if it doesn't make sense. And the cost of making mistakes and risk goes down substantially. So this is the way to go for doing new softwares, and literally it can save you 90% of time, 90% of cost, and gives you all the flexibility in the world. Now, this is just this is my last slide, and you may or may not be able to read it all. If you do some search, you can find it, but there is like hundreds of different low code, no code software, like I'm saying, and each of these are for their own specific need. For example, Wix. So Wix is for building a you can build a website, as well as you can easily build an e-commerce with it. And it costs nothing, like $10 a month or something like that. You don't need a developer. You can just do it all by yourself. And there are so many more for various different things that you can use. Well, that's mainly it, I guess, what I have to say here. The only other thing is Quick Reach is our product, and that's what we also do other than building software for clients. So it's not all from outside, but there are also local companies and all doing it as needed. I think that's about it, what I have, JJ. Back to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Let me see. Maybe we'll stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. Yeah.
All
Okay,
right.
there you go.
Okay, let me see what I can do here. So we can get everyone on the same page. This is what happens when you're running the thing at the same time. Hold on. Calorie view. There you go. Okay, so we have so we're back, and for the Q&A. So thanks. First of all, thank you for your presentations and the insights. That's a lot of stuff to absorb. Now, I guess my question is, there are a couple of questions actually posted. One is quite interesting. Is Agile possible in government procured projects? Because in these kinds of projects, usually the government comes out with these terms of reference, like this is exactly what we want, this is our budget, this is the timeline. And I don't know about maybe something to do with the nature of the government procurement law. Is that necessarily incompatible with an Agile?
At this moment, from what I know, yes. The current procurement law does not allow two things. They have problem with subscription model, which is the way to go for reducing cost and making everything OpEx. And second thing, they have no provision for going for Agile, which basically just increases the risk. So, yeah.
That's interesting. So I guess that's something that should be brought up with the Government Procurement Policy Board in terms of improving their...
Because those two can actually substantially reduce the risk of failed projects, which is quite common, I would say.
What about, you mentioned low code, no code.
Correct.
If you were to try to implement that within a government agency, I guess it would mean you would spend money training your guys to learn low code, no code, and then sort of iteratively develop from the ground up as they get more subscribers. Is that how it would work?
Users rather. So first of all, government also probably cannot subscribe unless it's like Microsoft or something, which is already part of the DVM's approved list. So most subscription-based software are probably not possible to purchase by government or LGUs or anyone. There are some ways some people say they can do it, like they can buy it as a managed service from a vendor who bundles it together with service and offers it on an annual price tag. It's a it's a roundabout way of going, but I think to adapt to the modern way of things, government procurement should built in provision for that.
Okay. So
Yeah, just to add,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
and just to add, because sometimes when you look at the terms of reference of government contracts, they usually have a provision demanding for ownership over the piece of software or whatever is being provided. And as Arup mentioned, that's usually incompatible with like subscription model, the low code, no code way of doing things.
Yep.
Okay.
That's true. JP, I think I did not answer part of your question. You were saying the cost of training, and also a lot of the platforms actually have free trainings or free certifications, or there's some amount of investment, of course. And sometimes there are partners who actually do the implementation for the requirement. So even if the company doesn't have the capability yet to build on their own, they can get someone as a service provider to do it while their team gets comfortable with it, so they can pick it up after the initial implementation and keep doing it.
All right. I'm gonna share one of the screens from Attorney Lars's present. Oh, let me see what I'm not doing it. Let me see. This one. So this is a page from Attorney Lars's presentation, talking about milestones and how in a lot of the contracts, this is how it is expressed. There is a milestone one. When you meet milestone one, you get paid. The vendor gets paid. And so she talks about acceptance testing, because that's at the end of each milestone, you go through acceptance testing, and then you get paid. So this is good for, obviously this is for Waterfall, where each milestone, right, represents a certain phase in the development as you build up the entire project. But this doesn't really apply that well for Agile, because in Agile, do you know the milestones or you don't know the milestones?
No, in Agile, there is nothing like that. So what is sure in Agile is every sprint, end up, let's say 15-day, there will be output that can be validated and tested and handed over. So which is fine. But there is, and the criteria for acceptance of those can be predefined. So in a way, it looks similar, but you cannot write it up front in the contract what would be delivered at which point.
So it's more of you document that as the project progresses, your project documentation at the meetings, which brings me back to the next question. I understand that in many of these projects, it's important that that there's documentation. Can you talk about that and the role of how well the teams work with each other?
So there are different kinds of documentation, and sometimes it can be quite confusing. So there is what you call the requirement documentation. And see, the other part of the flip side of the documentation is, while it reduces risk, it's also a cost. More documentation you do, you're incurring expensive cost of people writing stuff that you're actually not going to use. But then it does reduce the risk. So sometimes if you work with a lot of matured like CMMI 5 vendors, they will insist on documentation. And literally 30% plus of your money has gone into writing papers. So that's one side of it. There's other documentation is what you call user manuals. You need that. Without that, you cannot use it. So that one is very important and needs to be there. The third kind of documentation, now if someone is writing a source code, there should be enough documentation inside the code. So a new developer can read and understand the process and the logic. That one is tricky, and a lot of time, most developers are not good at documenting. And if someone wants to get the source code, they should set that provision and agree on the amount of inline documentation. so that
Right.
anyone else picking it up can do something with it.
Right. So my understanding from a layman's standpoint is that so source code is a bunch of let's say it's a bunch of equations, right? It's a bunch of
Logic. Yeah.
logic processes, right? And you know what you need is the programmer to stop and then create a sort of a box and say this next part here, this is what it's going to do.
Yeah.
So
Section
it's
by
describing.
section.
Right,
Yes.
right. And if you don't have that per section, what happens is, and this relates to the one of the questions that was posed about vendor lock-in. Because what happens is, if you do own the source code, but the only one who understands all of the way the code works, then only the vendor can support it.
Yeah.
And I think in some organizations, sometimes it's only one person in the organization understands the entire source code. When that guy leaves the company,
Or gets
you
hit
you
by a
basically
truck.
lost your support.
Or get more
Right,
stressed.
right. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're proposing that, except for situations where you're really going to make money on the software, where it's critical for you to make money. You're better off not using that kind of model because you would really need full-time people to maintain it.
It's going to be super expensive because, someone meeting all those provisions like what Attorney Lars listed down, it's going to cost money. More work, more risk provision someone builds in, more expensive it gets. So at some point, it
Right.
just doesn't make sense for someone to build custom software codes.
Okay. There's a question here. Maybe this is more. Well, actually, we'd like to hear your perspective as well. The first question was, how do we deal with the take it or leave it situation when it comes to contract terms? So normally, actually, this goes both ways. This one talks about a provider. Typically, the contract comes from the provider. It doesn't come from the client. And normally the situation is they will say, well, it's a take it or leave it. So maybe we'll ask Lars to answer that first. How would you deal with a situation where the vendor or one of the parties says take it or leave it?
Actually, that's usually the first thing you get when you're trying to negotiating a contract. They'll say it's a take it or leave it contract. Now, it would really depend on whether or not you have leverage to negotiate those terms. So let's say you're just getting a license to use some standard piece of software, let's say Microsoft, or something similar to that. Then of course it would be difficult for you to actually force the provider to negotiate those terms. But let's say you're a customer, you're building maybe a payment software, let's say from scratch.
Right.
And you're paying a huge amount, and you know that the provider wants to make a sale. Then maybe in those instances, you can actually negotiate your way around the contract. So sometimes it helps when negotiating, it helps to require for example, if they don't want to budge on the warranties, then have them explain why what their concerns are, why they don't want to change it. And sometimes you find out as a customer that actually what they're saying doesn't really make sense, and you can push to negotiate certain provisions.
Right.
Ayun. But at the end of the day, it really depends on whether or not you have leverage, I would say.
That's right. So that's a good technique, to find out why they are saying it's take it or leave it. Sometimes it's a situation where the reason why they say take it or leave it is because you're talking to the sales guy and basically saying, if our lawyers in Singapore, so if you want to negotiate this, I have to send this to Singapore, wait for 3 weeks before that guy comes back. If we want to close this deal, so then we're going to have to work as much as possible to the terms. So that's another usual concern. So look at the concern and then strike through that.
Yeah. And also sometimes the problem lies in the failure to communicate or to coordinate between the legal team, the provider's legal team, and the provider's business team. Sometimes the business is actually okay with changing some of the terms, but the legal is taking a hard stance. So, I mean, at the end, if business wants to make that deal, they could probably force legal to adjust.
Right.
Yeah, just to add on that, as rightly said, today, and like I've been saying from the beginning, to build custom software is not a good idea. And if you're not building custom software, the chances of you're going to use something like a SaaS software or cloud software. Once you're buying or subscribing to a cloud software, most of those are boilerplates and no one is going to change that. So, you can either be comfortable with the vendor and the clause and get it, or you have to find alternative. But no cloud or no SaaS vendor will actually do a custom contract.
Okay. There's another question here on a warranty clause. And the question is, can we provide a sample warranty clause wherein a customer will make the service provider warrant third-party software? And I think the question they're asking is it possible to ask a provider, right, to say, you don't just warrant your code, you warrant somebody else's code. And what, is that possible?
I don't think anyone will agree to that, because what it does is you're asking them to be responsible for, let's say, for Microsoft or someone like, but they have no recourse. I mean, you can probably force someone to go for it, but obviously if you try to go back to that, you won't be able to implement it.
Right. But I guess it depends also on the context of the contract, right? If what is expected is an integration contract where I supply you hardware and software, there must be some sort of warranty that they work well together. Because otherwise,
if it was designed by the integrator, but if you already decided it and then brought in the integrators, obviously.
Right. But I guess also if a software provider incorporated somebody else's code, like open source code, into your code, then you take responsibility for that. So
yes,
it would depend on situation.
And I want to add a little bit on that. So there are different types of open source license. So most popular ones are like what you call Apache, or you can hold on.
BSD. Yeah, so there are different kinds of, I'll just continue that thought. Okay, go ahead.
So what I was saying is, like, there are like MIT and their Apache contracts, which are very flexible, and it does not require any kind of sharing back the code or restrict from selling or anything like that. So yeah, I think when asking the vendor if they're using any open source, I think the next question to ask is what kind of contract or what kind of license the open source has.
Right.
Yeah.
And how about your company? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, ideally, you have the vendor disclose all the open source software being used in a separate annex, and then together with the link of all the license terms.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that what we've discovered is that there are a lot of development teams that incorporate open source software into their code, but they're not very strict about complying with the terms of the open source license. So it's a very broad term, open source. I guess the least restrictive of open source what do you call that, licenses, all that is required is that the person or the one who incorporated the code, all you need to do is give a recognition, right, sort of credit only to the other source code that you copied from. You don't have to do anything more than that. In the most sort of restricted type of open source.
A lot of them actually mentions that you should not mention them in your code. So like
they say so like mention that this was that you used, right, you used say BSD. But the other one that's most restrictive is what they call copyleft. And in copyleft, what happens is, so the purpose of open source is to put there's this concept called copyleft, which is supposed to be the opposite of copyright. So in copyright, you use copyright law so that the maker of the software has exclusive rights to the software. Copyleft uses copyright law, but in a different way. It says that if you make something, you're supposed to give it away. I'm giving you the right to use my software, make new software from it, make derivative works from it. But if you do so, if you improve my code, you are required to give away your code as well. So now, copyright law is being used to make sure that access to the code is always open.
Yes.
Which is contradictory to the way copyright law works, where the way copyright law works is that you're supposed to use copyright law to make sure no one else has access to the code. Okay.
So
How does a
definitely
customer, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just
No,
saying
you're saying, I think you're going to say copyleft. Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying copyleft is a risky one for a corporate's use scenario.
Right. I think there was a situation before where this many years ago, where it was discovered that a certain type of Unix code or flavor of Unix had incorporated code that belonged to a certain company. That company ended up sending demand letters to people all over the world saying that you owe us license fees. So that's the problem there. Okay. How does a customer protect itself from a contract for a software with a limited license period? Yeah, I guess the problem there is how vulnerable you are to the limited license period. I mean, this might be related to vendor lock-in, where what happens is when the license expires, you can't access your data anymore because you need the software to access your data. And this might be a good time for Arup to talk about open standards or open formats.
Yeah. So I think one of the thing to ask when you're going for SaaS is if they have provision to get your data back,
Yeah.
and or download it in some format, and that should be there, and most of them have it. It's just that most don't make it easy either to get it, uh, but most actually have it. But the reality is, if you're choosing a SaaS and you're using them, you probably need to continue using them. But most of them have also APIs. So there might be some point you can extract the data even without downloading it, just enough for moving to another software. But yeah, I mean, those are thoughts that has to go through someone's mind before you go business critical software that you adopt.
All right. You have something to add, Attorney Lars?
No, I'm good.
There's so many questions
Yeah.
now. Actually, the questions are
coming.
getting more. Yeah, they're even more. They're more. So let's go to the one on top from Mr. Nexter Lim. If my software is based on a third-party software, so he built it on Microsoft .NET framework, and a security vulnerability is found, which I suppose is a security vulnerability not on his software but on Microsoft, how can he protect himself as vendor against damages?
I don't think the vendor is liable for a vulnerability on a like a Windows or something, right? I mean, that's probably
Oh
how the
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, unless of course the breach is due to, like, let's say, insufficiencies, like this like backdoor access or whatever. When it was delivered, there were already security vulnerabilities. Yeah, and
I mean,
then
backdoor. If there was an intentional backdoor left open or something, that's a different thing. But otherwise, if someone is buying a software, whoever makes it, the responsibility of keeping the cybersecurity aspect of that is actually with the buyer, whoever is using the tool. So if you're an e-commerce company, you're getting PCI compliance. It's your job to do pen test and all on a regular basis. So I don't think in that kind of scenario, it can be transferred to the vendor unless the vendor
But I think
like outside of an intentional misconduct.
Right, right. I think what Mr. Lim's concern is that, he's the one who delivered the product to the customer. And when the breach happens, right, the customer will look to him. The customer might sue him first, right? And then he would have to say, no, it's not my fault. It's actually Microsoft's fault. But that might be expensive because then he would have to engage a lawyer to defend himself in court to thresh it all out. So there's that. That would be I think a legitimate concern. I mean, legally, what I would say is that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess if the issue is data breach, then this is where it would be important for both parties. Like, let's say if the provider is preparing an HR system for a client, and then in order to finish the project, the client would have to turn over like HR information about its employees, and then suddenly what happens is there's a breach. Now the customer could be blaming the provider that the breach happened on the provider's end. Then it's important for the provider to document whatever processing it did to the data. And to prove that, like, let's say the breach didn't happen because of its fault, it's actually from another
So
cause.
you're talking about data privacy law now. Yeah,
No, I mean like
I was going
any
to say
breach,
that,
any type of breach. Yeah.
right. I mean, in these types of, whether it's a breach of contract or if the cause of action is what lawyers call tort or quasi-delict, meaning it's because of negligence, they would have to prove that you are negligent. So if you are not negligent and the breach is through somebody else's negligence, then you're not liable. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe some of it
there's
can
actually
be
a question. Go ahead.
maybe some of it can be written in the contract itself upfront, that any any liability arising from third party
Yes.
components that are not in the control of the vendor
Yeah.
excludes, something like
Yeah,
that.
like
Well,
despite
you could
exercise of
argue.
diligence. Yeah.
Well, the customer could say, I didn't choose Microsoft.net. You chose Microsoft.net. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that goes, I mean, so that's a good question, right? If it's a vulnerability that was well known and it was not addressed. Actually, there was a situation that we handled years ago. Interestingly enough, a big system failed, and it turns out that the reason it failed was because a certain piece of software, database software they were using, failed. And the reason it failed is because it had a limitation in a certain part of the way its database worked. What was funny was that in the Philippines, the system only accommodated, I think, about 1.5 million customers. And the database company was saying, we don't understand. This system is used internationally by institutions that have millions of customers, like 10 million customers, and it doesn't fail. So we don't understand what it failed. And it turns out that the Philippine provider that created the architect or the design of the system did not know of that limitation in the software. So the fault wasn't so much on the software provider, the fault was on the person designing the software. So this is sort of the thing where you need to uncover where the fault is, and it is that party whom you can hold responsible. Okay. There's a question that was asked earlier a bit. I really don't know how to answer this question, but I'll just throw it out there. Maybe Lars can answer this. For money remittance companies, should there be a separate contract between a selected program provider, say online payment, and what contract should be provided?
Okay, I think so. I'm taking this from, like, let's say you're an e-commerce platform and then you want to integrate maybe a payment solution.
No, I think they're a remittance company and then they want to tack on an online payment solution onto their platform.
Okay, so that would really depend on the arrangement. Like if it's just an API integration, then, well, number one, you definitely need a contract with them. So now you try to determine what sort of engagement you'd have with them. So like, let's say you'll just provide an API integration with your system just to allow your users to access their service. So that's going to be like some type of licensing agreement. Now it's another thing if, let's say, paano ba? If they develop it for you and then you white label it as your own. So also that's also a licensing arrangement. What's the question?
I guess if you're a remittance company, you'd probably need to get BSP. You'd need to follow the outsourcing rules of BSP.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Some of these questions are data privacy questions. If we acquire international, is there any necessary law we will consider that if they will acquire an international provider?
Is there?
So maybe we actually have data privacy next week. And actually I'm considering we'll start up. We used to provide this free data privacy basic, so we'll do that. We'll restart that, and hope you can attend and you can ask that question there. These are data privacy questions. How do you address?
We can take the first one. The first one.
Take the first one? Okay.
From Sheila.
Enlighten us in the content of outsource data sharing agreement of a third.
I mean, just in the context of developing software, as I mentioned a while ago, because I get this question from the developers a lot. Like, let's say they're just developing a system for their customer. What would their responsibility or liability be in terms of the data that's being transferred to them? So definitely you need to have a data outsourcing agreement just to clarify that you're only holding on to the data precisely because of the instructions of the customer. And from your end, you have to make sure that you're only handling that data in order to fulfill your obligations as a software provider or an integrator to the customer. So yeah, I guess that's how far we'll go now.
Yeah.
In terms of yung data privacy stuff, we'll save some of it for the next session.
Okay, this is a very good question here. How do you address a situation where you have a company that has legacy software and then you want to update? And then there might be some transition where as you're using all this new software, and I guess as suggested by Arup, it probably might not be developed, but might be low code, no code. How do you integrate that or manage that from a process standpoint, I guess, a software standpoint, and then maybe we'll take it from a legal standpoint?
Well, there are different ways of going about handling that. There are some softwares which are like totally closed and literally no API, and also there are robots, RPAs, that can be used to basically emulate the human activity for the integration purposes. So that's possible. Otherwise, there are other tools available. Depends on, sometime it might just be better to replace the legacy software with something new and modern that probably will cost less than even the cost of managing the server that is running it now. But in case they still need to use it and it's unique and there are other reasons why it is, there are ways to handle that.
Right. I think there's some companies that are using systems that are probably built in the 90s on hardware that has no. This is what I heard. I don't know if this is true. The switching system in I think LRT, the one that runs on EDSA, runs on either a 386 or a 486. And so what they've been doing is they've been looking for old 486 computers and just like replacing motherboards when the thing fails, because there's just you can't buy the hardware anymore, right? So you have to go to the trunk shops to get that. So it's that sort of legacy system where you would need to transfer that over, and there are challenges, of course, in terms of LRT.
That will make me very worried to write it again, because that's if that system is connected to any network, it can be hacked by a kid from the school.
No, I'm sure it's a closed network. It was a closed network. I think I'm trying to think now, when they built it, it was the internet was still not that widely used in the Philippines. Okay, so from I guess from a legal standpoint, I don't know. Are there? It's more of I think the biggest issue normally in these transformational concerns are the data, or you need to port your data. What's that called again? You take the old data and then you make it. Yeah, the data migration is a...
Data migration is a pain, and data migration is probably the biggest risk in any project. And especially for a very large scale project, that's the biggest unknown and biggest risk factor that we have always experienced. So, and as a vendor, I would never go for a fixed price contract on data migration because there is just so many unknowns. You will lose your shirt.
Well, I guess if you just say you limit the fields that you want to port over, then you can probably do
there's
fixed.
just so many things that can go wrong that is beyond. So, you know, from so many experience, that is not, so you can still do a fixed price contract if you want to risk it, but you have to separate out the part that goes to data migration. And that one can be done in a separate engagement.
Okay, okay. Okay, so last question. We're a bit over time. If we bought a software through a third-party vendor, can we be held liable for a breach of terms, even though we have not dealt directly with the provider? Maybe Lars first?
Yeah. For a third-party vendor, okay. I think in those instances, even if it's a third-party provider, you would have probably agreed to the terms of the license that's already embedded in the software itself. So if you do breach the terms of those embedded license, then you could be held liable by that third-party provider directly.
You know, the funny thing is they didn't say who you're liable to, right? I thought they were saying, like, if I buy SAS through a third-party vendor, can SAS, right?
Go after you.
SAP, for example, go after me for breach. If that's the question, if it's
of
from
the SAP
standpoint of the
license,
software, yes, I think the answer to that question is normally, even though you're going through a vendor, if you're buying, say, software from SAP, there will be a direct relationship. They normally find a way, whether they assign the license to you, or in some cases it's a direct contract between you and that vendor, and that the integrator, whoever stands in the middle, is just a pass-through.
Yeah, because I think all contracts that you sign are like, if you are signing SAP contract, even if whoever sells it, you're still signing it on a contract of SAP or by clicking when you're accepting. So the arrangement, the agreement is direct, even though someone else sold it to you.
Yeah,
even if there's a
my
reseller.
recollection, right? My recollection, though, is that, and I could be wrong, was that SAP was unique in the sense that in SAP, instead of SAP having a direct relationship with you, they give the license to the local vendor, and then the vendor turns around and assigns it. Is required to assign it. So there's still a direct relationship, except that instead of one contract, there's two. But you end up with a direct relationship anyway. So that's pretty much standard. But I guess the another way of looking at it is that if a vendor, let's say you are a company and you're let's say you're a Palawan pawn shop, and you say, okay, let's integrate coins, you know, the coins service for all our customers in all over the country. And there's a problem with the software that they got from coins. They say white labeled coins, right? Would they be liable? And the answer to that question is yes, you are liable if you're the one operating the software, if your customers are relying on you providing a service. So does that mean that you can turn around and hold coins liable? It would depend on the type of breach and what sort of disclaimers are in the contract. Normally these contracts have, and actually I don't know if Lars mentioned it in her talk, a lot of these contracts have liability limitations, which are so confusing, right? That they layer on top of each other. It's hard to tell anymore who's responsible for what, or is there a liability limitation or not? Do you have anything to add to that, guys? I'm gonna turn to gallery's view. Okay, everyone can see us now. Okay. You have anything to add? Maybe some closing parting thoughts?
There was one more open question there.
No, I closed it already. That was the question I answered about liability. I guess you didn't really buy into that into having that risk anyway, right? All I'm saying is that, you know, I mean, if you use software, you know, if for example, let's take the case of Quick Reach. Quick Reach is a low code, no code type of service, if you don't anticipate that the customer of your user, of your customer, the customer of your customer will sue Quick Reach, right? It's probably the customer of your customer will sue your customer, right? Right? The end user will sue the customer, and the customer would hold you responsible. And it would depend on where the failure is.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, if it
And
is more
normally
about their service, then it's not our problem, right? Now, if it was
right,
something like a data breach or something, well, that's a different
right.
thing.
Yeah, I mean, you hardly hear of people suing Google, right? Or suing an end user. So there's just so many, you just don't do that. Okay, so some parting thoughts before we close out. Arup?
I guess from my side, it's like, the best. So we talk about managing risk, and the first step of managing risk is identifying the risk. And once the risk has been identified, the best course of action, which usually when I talk to the student, they say mitigation, I tell them, no, actually avoidance. The first thing and the best thing to do with risk is avoid it. If there's a way, avoid it. The second thing you do is transfer it. So, let it be picked up by someone who can handle it better. Then third is when you go for, mitigation and reducing the impact of it and so forth. But the first and the best way to go about is choose a method, choose something that will avoid dealing with the risk in the first place.
All right, thank you, Arup. Lars?
All right. From my end, I guess like as a lawyer, parting words. Okay. So I think when you're faced with because usually lawyers come in, they put a contract in front of you and then you review it. So I would suggest that to manage that whole process and to be a more effective legal advisor, don't limit yourself to the contract in front of you. Try to understand what the goals of whoever you're representing, like whether it be the provider or the client. Try to understand what they want to happen, what their goals are, because you wouldn't want like spending a lot of time going through the contract, changing everything to suit your client because it's the ideal. These are the ideal provisions, etc. You'd actually want your provisions to make sense for your client and to guide or to what they call this, to enable the client to get what they want or to yeah to end up with the product that they want. So
All right,
there.
thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our guests today, Attorney Lars and Arup. We hope to see you in the upcoming episodes of Digital Transformation Thursdays next week. We have an exciting panel on data privacy trajectories where we have a speaker from Singapore's ABLI, the ASEAN Business Law Institute, and she will talk about her ideas about where data privacy could be headed in the ASEAN context, in the Philippine context as well. And we will also have as a guest the National Privacy Commission, Mon Libon. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank
You.
you.